There seems to be this assumption now that Europe is in managed decline. It's something that I hear quite a bit. It often comes from conservative Americans and Brits, but also from Europeans themselves. There's even a sense that if you're honest about preferring to live in Europe, you must be settling. And so people hedge, they criticize Europe before anyone else can, they preempt the accusation, and they say, yes, it's slow, yes, it's overregulated, yes, it's declining, almost as a way of proving they're not naive. And yet, despite this supposed decline, tens of millions of people continue to build their lives here by choice. And Europe is still the #1 tourist destination in the world, with countries like France and Spain and Italy regularly in the top 5 most visited countries on the planet. So it's not as if people are trapped here. They are choosing to move and stay here. Now, I am well aware that Europe has problems, many of which I've talked about here and will continue to talk about on this channel. But that doesn't mean I believe it's finished or dying or over in some way. Quite the opposite. I think with just a few key decisions, Europe can change its trajectory dramatically if it wants to, because that is kind of the point here. So the European project is the most outrageous and ambitious project certainly in modern history. I think we tend to forget that, the actual audacity of trying to bring powerful historical enemies and rivals to merge together and find a common thread is ridiculously difficult, and we don't really know if it will succeed. Serious problems are to be expected. This was never going to be easy because there is no precedent for this. It is actually something that's truly new and original. The problem is neither that Europe is secretly thriving or that its problems are imaginary. It's that it's just often judged by the wrong standards, like using metrics designed for a different civilization with different historical context, optimizing for outcomes Europe was never trying to maximize in the first place. Just a quick note on terminology. I will do my best to differentiate between the EU and Europe. When I talk about the European project, I am referring to the philosophical idea of the EU, not the political and legal structures that it embodies. So the EU, while securing things like trade agreements and strategic alliances, does not optimize for dominance. World domination is not a goal, as it appears to be for some other regions. The whole idea of the EU was to create systems for integration and to limit national power. And in a day-to-day sense, the EU optimizes for stability because, ultimately stability is necessary for progress. And once you see that trade-off clearly, a lot of what looks like weakness really starts to look much more like intention. And I think this is a much more interesting conversation than just another round of self-flagellation. So what exactly are we measuring Europe against? Because most of the criticism aimed at Europe today assumes a very specific definition of success, one that Europe was never designed to maximize. So it usually involves speed, scale, capital concentration, market dominance, headline innovation, the size of companies rather than the quality of lives they shape. Measured this way, yes, Europe does look sluggish, overregulated, behind, almost pathologically cautious. And if you absorb enough Anglo-American business media, it's easy to internalize the idea that this is a moral failure and a lack of ambition. But this is where something subtle and very important gets missed, because Europe isn't underperforming at a game it's trying to win. It's being judged by metrics optimized for a totally different civilization. And that distinction matters a lot. European societies, particularly after the catastrophes of the 20th century, did not orient themselves around dominance. They oriented themselves around containment, around reducing downside risk, around making sure that life didn't spiral into chaos again. And this shaped everything from policy to urban planning to labor law to consumer protection, housing, even cultural norms around work, success, and restraint. The result is a system that often feels frustrating if you want speed, but quietly robust if you care about continuity and livability. The European cities devote significant land funding and political capital to what urban sociologists call non-transactional space, or third spaces, public parks, pedestrian zones, town squares, libraries, riverfronts, civic buildings, those kind of things. You've got the tree-lined streets, car-free historic zones, mandatory green space ratios in new developments, noise regulations, light pollution limits, height restrictions, heritage protections. Yes, this can all seem like a bit much, and it's one of the things that people mean when they talk about bureaucracy and like over-regulation. And yet Europeans keep choosing these things. So why is that? Well, it's because of what they optimize for. They optimize for psychological and social outcomes that don't necessarily show up in economic dashboards. So essentially, these policies are aimed at increasing the quality of life for citizens, to lower stress, to strengthen community, for environmental continuity, and a sense that public life still belongs to the public. Like, Europe's failure here is not one of neglect, but of trade-offs colliding. It's preservation versus expansion and continuity versus growth. And so those trade-offs don't happen by accident. They reflect a deeper civilizational preference to make life coherent even at the cost of speed. This is why so many professionals who could, in theory, live anywhere, pay less taxes, enjoy sunny weather all year round, quietly choose to stay even while complaining about bureaucracy and taxes or stagnation. And once you see that clearly, the taxes and the regulations and the unwillingness to change, it stops looking less like incompetence and starts looking like a choice. A choice that does carry costs with it, and one that becomes much harder to defend when judged by the wrong standards, which is exactly what happens when we turn to innovation. So real innovation, we're told, happens elsewhere, in the United States, in China, in places that move very fast, that take huge risks and accept chaos as the price of progress. So measured by the most common metrics, this story does seem quite convincing. Like, Europe produces fewer tech giants, fewer global platforms, less venture capital at scale, fewer companies that swallow entire markets in a single decade. If innovation is defined as speed multiplied by scale multiplied by capital concentration, Europe loses repeatedly. But this is where the metric error does its most subtle damage, because innovation is not a single phenomenon. Like, treating it as one collapses very different activities into a single scoreboard. Because what Europe struggles with is not ideas, it is appetite for volatility. So the dominant innovation model of the last 20 years is not simply about solving problems. It's about taking an idea, flooding it with capital, tolerating extreme failure rates, and accepting massive social disruption as collateral damage in the pursuit of market dominance. And that model privileges scale over stability and winner-takes-all outcomes over system coherence. Europe, and more specifically the EU, that has never fully embraced this kind of bargain, because the systems that the EU produced are explicitly designed to limit downside. So we have things like labor protections, bankruptcy law, consumer regulation, data protection, antitrust enforcement. These are not incidental obstacles placed in the way of progress. They are expressions of a value system that treats social stability as something to be protected, not like casually wagered. And that really changes the shape of innovation profoundly. In Europe, new technologies are asked much harder questions much earlier. It's not just like, does it scale, but who carries the cost if it fails? Not only what does it disrupt, but what does it displace? Innovation is expected to coexist with existing social structures, not bulldoze them into oblivion. And so this slows things down. It also filters things out, which is why Europe produces fewer moonshots and fewer catastrophes. Innovation here tends to appear in industrial optimization rather than consumer spectacle, and in systems that sort of quietly improve how people live rather than redefine how they perform. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because Europe remains one of the world's strongest regions for foundational research, for engineering and applied science, even if it captures less of the downstream spectacle. So some of the most consequential advances in artificial intelligence, in semiconductors, in pharmaceuticals and industrial systems, they originate in European universities, in research institutes and firms before being scaled more aggressively elsewhere. Google's AI leadership is inseparable from DeepMind in London. Meta's core machine learning research runs through Paris. Microsoft's cloud reliability owes much to decades of work at its Cambridge labs. And without ASML in the Netherlands, the modern semiconductor industry, including Nvidia, Apple, and TSMC, simply just doesn't function. So this is not a story of European failure. It is a story of where different civilizations sit in the innovation pipeline. Europe specializes upstream in science, engineering, and system integrity. The United States specializes downstream in capital deployment, market capture, and narrative dominance. And China and India are champions in manufacturing. Confusing these roles leads to the mistaken belief that only one side is innovating. Europe also innovates socially in ways that rarely register on global dashboards. Europe is running experiments in vocational education, in apprenticeship systems, in cooperative housing, in aging in place models, in labor representation and work-life integration. These are all attempts to solve problems that fast growth economies often just defer until later, until they become proper real crisis. Now, this doesn't mean that Europe gets everything right. Some regulation is genuinely sclerotic. Some caution really does create paralysis. Some systems protect incumbents at the expense of newcomers. But the mistake is assuming that Europe's failure to look like Silicon Valley is evidence of failure at all, because it isn't. Taken together, all of this points to the fact that Europe still offers a way of life that does not require constant optimization. Europe is faced with immense challenges, with demographic decline, immigration management, global escalating tensions, and shifting centers of power. No country or region is perfect, but given the circumstances, I think Europe is doing pretty well. I will continue to highlight the challenges and problems I see because I care, and by gaining clarity, it is only then possible to make changes. I love Europe. There is so much richness here, so much to enjoy, to look forward to, and to be grateful for, and to fight for. And I certainly would never bet against it. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one next. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.